Hello, and welcome to our final session all about the English Civil War. Today we're going to be doing two things. We're going to first of all work out what happened to Charles I, because at the end of last week we looked at the fact that he lost, and then we're going to be looking at this person who is known as Oliver Cromwell. We met him briefly last week because we talked about the fact that he was the one that created this organised army for Parliament called the New Model Army, who defeated Charles I. So we're going to look a little bit about Oliver Cromwell and decide at the end, was he kind of a hero or a usurper? So a usurper is somebody that kind of shouldn't have been where they were. But we're going to also think about Charles I, because I set you off with a mission to think about what you would have done with Charles I at the end of the English Civil War. Hello to everybody who's joining us in the chat, everybody over on YouTube, everyone watching on catch up, because it's a quiet time of year with people enjoying the sunshine. And my very first question I have for you is, which of these things doesn't fit? Now, in reality, you could have any answer. I've got my answer, but we've got Christmas, and we've got horse racing, and we've got the Bible, and we've got the theatre, alcohol, swearing and being rude, and dancing. So which of these things do you think doesn't fit? So there could be a few of them. Like, you could say that swearing and being rude is the odd one out, because all of the other things are things that people could enjoy, and swearing and being rude nobody would enjoy. But which one do you think is the odd one out? Hi Marie, I am shouting out to you. I've seen that you've requested that I shout out, so hello to Marie. So which do you think of these doesn't fit? And I kind of want a reason. So Jack's gone for the Bible. Lots of you have said the Bible. But why does it not fit? Yeah, so swearing and being rude is something that maybe, people could enjoy reading the Bible, people could enjoy Christmas, people could enjoy the theatre, people could enjoy going to horse racing, but swearing and being rude probably is something that nobody would enjoy. So somebody's put Christmas, because Christmas is like a celebration thing, and the others aren't really celebrating anything. So that's another one. So Christmas could be the odd one out. So some of us know some background about Oliver Cromwell, and you're saying that some of these things were banned under Oliver Cromwell. Someone's saying horse racing is the odd one out because that's the only sport. There's lots of ideas. Well, for me, the odd one out is the Bible. And this is because some of you have already got this. This was the only one of the things that was not banned in England, Wales and Ireland by Oliver Cromwell, because we're going to be looking at Oliver Cromwell today. And so going to the theatre, drinking alcohol, horse racing and betting on horse racing, dancing, swearing, and having big extravagant celebrations with presents at Christmas, they were all banned by Oliver Cromwell, who felt that England should be far more religious, far more simple, and so the odd one out is the Bible. But you could have lots of different odd one outs. Now, before we get on to Oliver Cromwell, we need to kind of think, how does he get where he gets? So he does actually become the ruler of of England, and he becomes the ruler because of the end of King Charles I's reign. Now, last week I set you up with something to think about, and the thing was that you had to think about is, what would you do with Charles I? So the war is ended. We talked about the fact that he was going to try and escape from Oxford dressed as a servant. He was captured. What do we do with him? So the first option was make peace and just forgive him and allow him to be king and hope he's learnt his lesson. The second one was to negotiate a new agreement to limit his power, so that his power was limited and that Parliament would have the final say. Remove him from power no longer have a royal family and send him into exile, so send him to a different country. Execute him, so kill him, because only then will peace be assured, and do nothing and let God decide. Now, what would you do? So if we could go back in time to the year that King Charles was captured, you would find people that support number 1, people that supported number 2, people that supported decision 3, people that supported decision 4, and people that supported decision 5. In fact, 5 was incredibly popular. Now, I'm not asking you to tell me what you know happens. I'm asking you what you would do. So 3 would be a good one, to banish him and send him into exile, so he's no longer in power. That's a good idea. Some people thought letting God decide was the best thing to do because they believed he was chosen by God. So that's a good one. It's a tough decision, as his supporters are always going to be there. They're always going to threaten you. But to be honest, there's always going to be that threat because Charles I had lots of children. So there's always going to be royalists that want to put a king back on the throne. Yeah, negotiating maybe, and see how he goes. So give him like a trial back as the king, but with Parliament having a better say. That's a good one. So it's tricky, isn't it? Some of you have gone for execute, but that's really quite harsh. Now, making peace and allowing him to be king. Well, some nobles, even in Parliament, so people that even lived, that were part of Parliament, just didn't like the idea of punishing the king. He was God's chosen king. And so therefore people felt that that was a bit harsh to punish a king. You can't punish a king because the king has been chosen by God. So people felt really uncomfortable about what to do with him. You know, they thought maybe he's learned his lesson. If we forgive him, we can have peace. But he's broken promises before. Can he really be trusted is a difficult one. Whoops. Now, negotiating a new agreement where his power is limited and keeping him as king. So lots of people thought that maybe that's a nice compromise. A sort of early version of what's known as a constitutional monarchy, where the king or queen is still there, but Parliament have the final laws. But it's really difficult because obviously in Parliament you have different groups of people supporting different ideas. Charles is quite clever. What happens if he starts playing different sides against each other and starts manipulating Parliament? That makes number 2 a little bit tricky. Removing him from power and banishing him is a difficult one. If you send him into exile, he's no longer anybody's problem. You can just get rid of him. You could put him in prison in another country. But the point is, he's still alive. So as Jack said, he was potentially rescued by royalists in the future. So Lucy says he's not chosen by God. Well, everybody at the time believed that he was. So you might not think that, but during this time, the Stuart era, that's what everybody believed. So that's a difficult one. Executing him, well, some people said no one, even a king, is above the law. They had execution as a punishment during this time. He caused a terrible war. Executing him will stop more wars. But actually, that's really shocking. The idea of killing a king who's been chosen by God was far too shocking for most people to even consider. And this was a really popular one, trying to let God decide, because they were very religious people. They believed that only God was available to judge the king. We, as human beings, we were too lowly to interfere with someone chosen by God. But again, if you do nothing, it almost makes the war a total waste of time. Joe would give him another chance. So that's a really difficult one. Isaac says he does change his mind, so that's a bit tricky. Somebody was talking about, the fact that Oliver Cromwell was well supported. So Clemby and Connie have an ancestor, John, who supported Oliver Cromwell. So that's also a really difficult one. Now, basically, after losing the war, Oliver Cromwell was a real, was a real big, had a really big say, I suppose, in what happened to Charles I. He was really almost the leader of the parliamentarians, creating this new model army that had defeated Charles I. And so what the decision was made was that actually the only fair way was to have a trial. So if you break the law, you're put on trial. The people believed he broke the law. He wasn't being a good enough king. And so they had a trial. And they put all of the evidence to the trial, and Charles I was found guilty. Now, this then led to him being executed. So lots of you know that he was executed, so he was put to death. But what I would say is this was absolutely shocking. This was the first time a king had ever been killed by his own country. So it was a huge, huge thing for England that they were executing their king. He had, as I said, a fair trial, but he was found guilty. And so after the king is gone, we don't have a king, and instead it's like, well, what should we do? Oliver Cromwell had been a strong leader of this army during the war. Lots of people trusted him. Lots of people thought maybe he would be a good person to keep the country safe. And so in 1653, Cromwell becomes what's known as the Lord Protector, which basically means he is the main leader of England. And it's a new way of trying to lead England. So that's what we're really going to look at today. The king is gone. It's very, very shocking. It left people incredibly shocked that he had been executed. Oliver Cromwell seemed the obvious choice because he had been such a safe and trusted person in the fight against Charles I. But what we're going to look at is, was he this hero? Was he the right replacement for Charles I? Was it the best decision for England? Or was he a usurper? And a usurper means somebody who should never, ever have been given the role of the leader of England. So we need to really think about, like, a saviour. Was he the saviour of England, or was he the usurper of England? So to get us thinking, we really need to know really what these words mean. So I've got a variety of different things here, and I want you to work out, does this define what saviour means, or does this define what usurper means? So this person would rescue people from danger. Is that a saviour or a usurper? This person would take control of something that didn't belong to them. These people would look up to this type of person and believe they helped and saved them. This person would help somebody when nobody else would. This person would pretend to be selfless, but really be selfish and power hungry. And this person would not be trustworthy, even though they may appear so. So which of those do you think define a saviour, and which people define a usurper? So Rose, we're having a think about, or we're going to think about whether Oliver Cromwell was a saviour or whether he was a usurper. And in order to do that, we need to work out what these words mean. So, quite interesting words. I quite like the word usurper. It's quite a good word. But what is the difference between a saviour? Now, the root word of saviour is to save. You can see the word save. So that might give you an idea. Let's go through them. So, a saviour is somebody who's going to rescue people from danger, who's going to help and save people, who's going to help people when nobody else would. So that's kind of somebody who's trustworthy, who's going to rescue people, who's going to save people, who's going to be a great leader, who's going to help when nobody else would. So if we think that Oliver Cromwell is a saviour, we're going to think that he was totally awesome, almost like a superhero, that he stepped in and he saved England. But a usurper is somebody who actually looks like that. They look like they're a hero. But underneath it, actually, they're a little bit power hungry. They're quite selfish. They take things when really they shouldn't be. And they're not really that trustworthy. So if we're going to go for the idea that Oliver Cromwell was a usurper, we're actually going to argue that probably he wasn't that much better than Charles I. He kind of took the throne of England when he shouldn't have done, because although he's the Lord Protector, he is in reality in charge, no different to Charles I. And maybe he wasn't this saviour. Maybe he didn't save people. Maybe actually deep down he was a little bit selfish and power hungry. So that's what we're going to decide. And I'm going to give you some evidence about Oliver Cromwell. And you're going to decide whether he was a saviour or whether he was a usurper. So the first one, you can shout it actually if you want at the screen. You can write an S or a U, but this is the first piece of evidence. So obviously Cromwell created a professional army. It was well trained, it was well equipped. He had strict rules, which meant that the army were well mannered. They behaved with good conduct. They fought well, and they were generally a pretty incredible army that could protect England. Now, Cromwell created this army. Cromwell was known as a Puritan, which basically, again, the root word of Puritan is pure. So he believed very much in being a very strict Christian. So whenever you see the word Puritan, it means somebody that believes that Christianity should be followed very, very strictly. So if he creates this army that is very, very good to protect England, does that make him a saviour or does that make him a usurper? Well, the reality is it makes him, I can't see any votes yet, but it makes him a saviour, because really, ultimately, if you are in charge of a country, you need to be able to protect it. So he has this army that can protect it. So well done if you shouted at the screen that this is evidence that he is a saviour. Now, he was offered the position of king. So Parliament and lots of rich nobles said to him, you know, you should be the king. You should be given the role of king. You should be called King Cromwell. But he refused it. He said, no, I am not supposed to be the king. I haven't been chosen by God. My role is just to protect the people. So he took the Lord Protector sort of role. So he called himself the Lord. I'm just here to protect my people. I'm not here to be the king. So he refused the position of king. So does that make him a saviour or does that make him a usurper? So he sounds quite a nice guy, I think. That again seems to make him sound like a pretty heroic person. He doesn't want to be the king. Surely if he was selfish and power hungry, he would have gone, yep, put the crown on my head. I'm going to be the king. Now, the next piece of evidence. It was Cromwell that really pushed to have Charles I executed. Lots of people, in fact, most people didn't support this idea of executing Charles I. And because Cromwell really pushed it, people did listen. He was quite influential, but it actually really angered a lot of people. It angered people in England, it angered people in Scotland, it angered people in Ireland. People argued that Cromwell was not listening to the people. So almost like the first decision he made wasn't really listening to the people that he was supposedly ruling, because people didn't support Charles I being executed. People thought they were going to be punished by God, and that it was not their decision to make. So what do we think? That doesn't make him sound like a hero and a saviour. Maybe that's a usurper. I can see lots of U's coming up in the chat. Now, by defeating Charles I, Cromwell gave more power to Parliament. Now, this is still relevant in the UK today. This was the start. Now, Parliament now have all the power. Parliament make all the laws, all the rules. The King makes no rules at all, no laws. Now, this was the start of it, with Cromwell giving more power to Parliament. So people vote for who they want to represent them in Parliament. It's a much fairer system, and Cromwell accepts that and gives more power to Parliament. So what do we think? Do we think that makes him a saviour or a usurper? I can see lots of S's coming into the chat. Are you shouting saviour if you're over on YouTube, or are you shouting usurper? Now, Cromwell didn't particularly like Catholic Christians. He argued that Catholics spent too much money, that their churches were too grand, that they were too frivolous with their money, and so therefore religion should be very simple. So he made laws against Catholics. He didn't like the way that Catholics worshipped God. And so he made laws against Catholics and the way that they decided to follow their religion. And he confiscated lots of their land and said, right, well, I don't agree with the way that you're worshipping God, and I'm going to take away your land as a punishment. So he ended up becoming fairly wealthy by confiscating the land of Catholics. Now, what do we think? Does that sound like somebody who is thinking about his people, or does that sound like a usurper? Now, in 1653, Cromwell had various ideas, and he went to Parliament and said, look, this is what we should be doing to run the country. And Parliament didn't agree. And so Cromwell went, all right then, well, you can all go home, and I'm shutting Parliament down. So he shut Parliament down by force in 1653 because he didn't like their decisions. Now, who does that sound a lot like? Who do we know that used to go to Parliament and ask for things, and then when Parliament said no, they just shut Parliament down and did it anyway? Now, who do we know that used to do that? Interesting. Is that a hero or is that a usurper? When in control of England, Wales and Scotland, Cromwell put generals in charge of each part of his kingdom, and they ruled through military force. So basically he had rulers in all areas of the country. And military force basically means you do what you're told, or the army comes and sorts you out. Now, does that sound nice? Or does that maybe sound a little bit scary, having military force? So in your area, if you live in Wales or you live in England or you live in Scotland, that there's an army there and a general, and they're in charge, and if you don't do what you're told, then you're ruled by military force. Does that sound a kind way? Does that sound like somebody who is a hero? Or do we think that doesn't sound particularly great? Now, the other thing to say is that Cromwell took control of the country. He wasn't actually chosen by everybody. People didn't actually vote him in. He just assumed control. So he said, I think lots of people, I reckon I'll be a good leader. Lots of people support me. I'm going to be the person in control. Now, you might argue, is that really very different from Charles I? He wasn't actually voted there. Now, the next one is Cromwell led his cavalry. He called the cavalry his cavalry. Remember, cavalry are soldiers on horseback. He named his cavalry the Ironsides, and he always led by example. So he always was at the front. So unlike Charles I, who would have been right at the back of a battle, he was right at the front. He would make sure that he led by example, that he kept morale high, and that he made sure that everybody that fought for him, that he wasn't asking anybody else to do something that he wasn't prepared to do. So it's quite tricky, isn't it? It's quite a lot of evidence about Oliver Cromwell. So hopefully there's been lots of ideas in the chat, but these are really the ones that make him that hero, that make him that saviour. He did have this big army that was well trained, that protected the UK. He didn't assume the rule of king. He did give more power to Parliament, and he did make sure that he led by example. So there's lots of positives to Cromwell compared to Charles I. But at the same time, lots of you worked out that really in some ways he was no better than Charles I. So he shut down Parliament when he didn't get what he wanted. He made laws that were unkind. So Catholic Christians should be able to worship how they like. His rules were unkind, confiscating their land. Charles I was also unkind with his shipping tax, if you remember, and lots of other taxes. He ruled by quite a lot of, it was quite strict with military force, and he wasn't even voted in. So there's lots of evidence as well to suggest that he was a bit of a usurper. I mean, he wasn't even voted in. You could argue that if he was voted in, that maybe that would have made some of the decisions okay, but he wasn't voted in. So it's a really tricky one. So what do you think? Was Oliver Cromwell a saviour, or was he a usurper? Was he just as bad as Charles I? It's a bit tricky, isn't it? Because Charles I probably had some good points about him, but also some not good points about him. But really, there's not, I don't think. Lots of you going for 50-50. Come on, you can't sit on the fence. You've got to make a decision. But it's kind of one of those things that really, was he a saviour? I've got to really, my interpretation is that possibly he was a bit of a usurper, a bit of a chancer. Kind of, he wasn't really voted in. And I think the biggest unforgivable thing is that he sent Parliament away when he didn't get what he wanted. I can't see how that's any different to Charles I. And I think this was a really big time to have made a change to how England was ruled, and he didn't really take it. So my vote would be usurper. Quite a few people supporting me in the chat, some of you sitting on the fence. But what we can say is that the Civil War didn't just change who ruled England, but it did change how people thought about what was fair, what was free, what power should look like. And these ideas are still important today. So he did get a bit power hungry. I think he did probably start off with really good intentions. And I think he probably, like Jack says, did get a bit power hungry. But regardless of what we decide, what it does do, this change from Charles I to Oliver Cromwell, is that it gives us this idea of how should England be ruled and how should people be ruled. Because ultimately there are a lot of people, there needs to be some sort of control and direction from somewhere. And what's fair and what should be the right way to run a country. And that's what makes the English Civil War so significant, because it starts off those chats, it starts off those discussions. And it has an effect on us today, because you can see that there's a drawing of Charles III, which I think is quite apt. It's the first time I've taught the English Civil War where we have a Charles on the throne. But what we now have is what's known as a constitutional monarchy, which means that the king or queen is still part of the country, but they don't make the big decisions. So we have Charles III on the throne. He is the king of England. However, he's just a symbol. So he goes around the world and he represents the country. And he raises awareness of various charities, and he shares his opinion on a few things, but he doesn't make any decisions at all, big decisions. All of the laws in this country are made by Parliament, and Parliament is a group of people who have been elected by people like your grown-ups. So obviously when you're 18, you're allowed to vote, and you vote for who you want to represent you in Parliament. So each group, each area that you live in will have a representative, and they will go to Parliament and they will represent you. And so the Civil War is probably one of the most significant events in our history, because it moves us towards a constitutional monarchy where you have the figurehead of the king or the queen, but the Parliament rule the whole of the country, which is a lot fairer. It took a little while to get there. Oliver Cromwell certainly starts off that process by giving Parliament far more power. So what happens to him in the end is a really good one. So what happens to him in the end is that he just dies, he passes away, and then we end up with a really we end up with another big issue of, well, what is fair and what is free and what should power look like? So basically, Charles I is executed, Oliver Cromwell becomes a Lord Protector. It's not quite the way that we kind of want the country to be ruled, because, like you say, there's a bit of problems with his rule. He dies, and then the decision is made that Charles I's son, Charles II, who is still alive, he is living in exile, so Prince Charles would be invited by Parliament to come and be the king. So Oliver Cromwell dies, and then Charles I's son becomes Charles II, and he is invited to come back to England and rule, but with far less power than his father had. So that's kind of what happens in the end. But let's have a think. If we hadn't had the English Civil War, would we still have a king or queen with total power today? Is Charles II any good? Oh, that could be a whole new topic. So would we still have a king or queen with total power today? And what might that look like? I'm just going to pose some of these questions for you to think about, because without the English Civil War, we may have Charles III on the throne. He might be there with total power. So without the English Civil War, we could have had a king or queen with total power, which isn't very fair. If we hadn't had the English Civil War, would people be allowed to vote in elections? So we vote for who we want to represent us in Parliament. Would we be doing that if we hadn't had an English Civil War? Would the Prime Minister even exist if we hadn't had an English Civil War? So the Prime Minister is the person that controls the government, that pushes the direction of how the country is run. Would the Prime Minister even exist? So our Prime Minister at the moment, would he even exist if we hadn't had an English Civil War? If we hadn't had the English Civil War and we had the king, and the king was completely in charge, would the king be able to ban pizza if he didn't like it? Or just bring in any rule that he fancied, which would affect us hugely? Because Parliament now will come up with a law. I think this should be the law. And then you have loads and loads of MPs who represent all areas of the country. They all debate and discuss, and then they vote for if they think this rule should happen. But if we just had one king in charge, and Charles III decided he didn't like pizza, he could just ban it, and we wouldn't be able to do anything about it. That would be a bit of a problem, wouldn't it? Would it still be okay for one person to control the country on their own, just because they were born into the royal family? And that's the biggest thing, because now, as I said, we have a very different world. The English Civil War changed the way that power worked. It showed that a king should be challenged and could be challenged, and maybe shouldn't be in charge just because they've been born into that position. And so after the war, people began to believe far more in fairness and shared power, and everybody being able to have a say, and not just one person ruling with no experience just because they were born into that role. And so the final thing to think about really is that we have a constitutional monarchy now. We do have a king or queen as our figurehead, but our government is chosen by the people. Now, that's not to say the government is perfect, because obviously it might not be the person, the party that has the most votes. They might not actually be the ones in charge at the end of the day. But it is deemed to be a lot fairer. So the Civil War helps to shape the democracy that we have now. So we would say we have a democracy where we can choose, we have the right to choose who rules our country, rather than having a king on the throne that's just there because he was born there. And so the English Civil War is one of the most significant events in our history. So I'm really hoping that that's given you a taste into why I thought it was important for us to look at the English Civil War. Don't forget to head over to our blog, where there's lots and lots of lovely activities and things that you can get going with. Hopefully you will have enjoyed we've done quite a lot of wars, haven't we? Because we've done the English Civil War, we've done the Battle of Hastings, and we did the War of the Roses. But hopefully those three conflicts have given you a good idea of how it has shaped our history. Now, that is it from me for Time Explorers and the English Civil War. So we've finished. It's now the summer, so do keep an eye on our socials for lots of things that I'm sure Lizzie will be sharing to keep you occupied during the summer. Don't forget, if you're coming for animation tomorrow, we are going to be looking at stop motion animation. I've got it ready to show you. So have a little think of what you might want to animate tomorrow. Are you going to bring some modelling clay? Are you going to bring some building blocks? Are you going to bring some vegetables? What are you going to bring to animate? Have a lovely rest of the week if I don't see you tomorrow, and enjoy the sunshine, and I'll see you soon.